Here comes the referee, Kung Fu Tzu Confucius, and his two linesmen, St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. And as the two skippers come together to shake hands, we're ready for the start of this very exciting final. The referee, Mr. Confucius, checks his sand, and they're off. Nietzsche and Hegel there. Karl Jaspers, number 7 on the outside. Wittgenstein there with him. There's Beckenbauer. Schelling's in there, Heidegger covering. Schopenhauer.
Hello again. I hope by now that you are all getting so excited and enthralled by the wealth of ideas that you're finding in Plato's dialogues that you've already vowed that you're going to continue reading Plato after the end of this course. Well, this week we're going to be looking at 3 of Plato's dialogues, the Phaedo, the Symposium, the Meno, and you also have a few selections out of one of his major dialogues called the Republic. Now the Phaedo, you will see, it follows dramatically right after the Apology and the Crito that you've already read. The Apology is Socrates' defense speech at his trial, when he was put on trial for corruption of the youth, for not respecting the gods of the state, and for introducing new gods. The Crito, of course, takes place on the night before Socrates' execution. And the Phaedo is Socrates' final conversation with others just before his execution. Now you might notice that the character of Socrates in the Phaedo sounds and seems to behave markedly different from the character of Socrates in the Apology or the Crito, or in some of the other Platonic dialogues, if you've read any others, like maybe the Euthyphro or the Laches or some of those other early dialogues. And indeed, though the dramatic date of the Phaedo fits neatly in with the Apology and the Crito, it's generally assumed that this is a dialogue that Plato wrote much later. We generally divide Plato's dialogues into 3 periods, rather unimaginatively called the early, middle, and late period. Now, which dialogues go in the early period, which in the middle, and which in the late? Well, nobody really knows for sure. We can tell a few things. Right? It's often assumed that maybe the Apology is the first of Plato's works, and there's a tradition that Plato wrote poetry while young, and as a result of the trial and execution of Socrates, Plato burnt all of his poetry and started writing philosophy. Perhaps the Apology was the first thing that he wrote. There's a very long dialogue called the Laws, which we won't be reading any of this course, but this is known to be the last thing that Plato wrote. It wasn't completed, though it's very long. We know from Aristotle, writing would have been done on wax tablets with a stylus and then later transferred to papyrus. Aristotle tells us that Plato died while the Laws was in the wax, so we know that that was the last thing that he wrote. There have been various ways to try to determine and date and order the dialogues with various different sorts of principles. We won't go into them. Just want to bring your attention to what we call the Socratic Problem. We know that Socrates himself did not write anything, so that all that we know about the historical Socrates we know through other writers. And we know primarily through Plato. We know that there are many other writers who wrote Socratic dialogues after Socrates' death. Plato's not the only one. But most of those are works that didn't survive. And the ones that we do have don't show too much philosophical insight. So what was the real Socrates like? Well, you might notice that the character of Socrates in the Phaedo doesn't look that much like the character of the Socrates in the Apology or the Crito. Remember the proclamation of the oracle at Delphi in the Apology and Socrates' reaction to it. Socrates himself is ignorant, he says, and his conclusion after investigating and questioning others is that others are just as ignorant as he is about the truly important things, but Socrates' own wisdom lies in his own awareness of his ignorance. And so his duty, his sacred duty to his fellow Athenian citizens, becomes that of questioning them, examining them, looking into their souls. And this becomes a way to disabuse them of that conceit of ignorance that everybody walks around with, thinking they know all kinds of things that they in fact do not. Well, now our Socrates in the Phaedo all of a sudden does seem to know some things, know a few more things than the Socrates who professes ignorance so vociferously seems to. And so most scholars have thought that this now is Plato speaking in his own voice through the character of Socrates that he'll continue to use. And so the usual distinction is that the early dialogues are those dialogues which most fit the model of what's called an operatic dialogue, a dialogue that ends in aporia, literally difficult passage. You see the pore, the root in aporia, see the pore, like the pores in your skin, a passage there. Dialogue that ends in aporia and a problem. Because the typical early dialogues start with Socrates asking a question of someone. Okay? What is courage? What is friendship? The person thinks they know the answer. Socrates says, that sounds great, let's examine that. They go back and forth until Socrates drives the conversation to a conclusion that his interlocutor doesn't feel comfortable with. So they go back and they revise their answer. Maybe they revise it again, and eventually they decide that they have other things to do rather than be quizzed by Socrates, and they leave. So the dialogue ends without any resolution, but going through and rejecting several definitions, several answers to this question, what is it? Right? And so those are the early dialogues. What have generally been taken to be the middle dialogues are dialogues where Socrates begins to formulate things that actually look like theories. It's not just raising questions and raising questions of the form, what is it? And then rejecting all of the answers that happen to occur to the interlocutor. Here we see something like a theory being formed, like Plato's theory of forms, for example, which we encounter here in the Phaedo, and which we'll be taking a closer look at shortly. So those dialogues, most scholars think, okay, so this is now Plato emerging, using still the character of Socrates and the genre of the Socratic dialogue in which to write his philosophy, but now expressing his own theories and his own views, going beyond what Socrates ever said. And then the dialogues that are generally considered the later dialogues are different still. There's less of the drama, less storytelling in them. They become more technical. There's an increase in technical sorts of terms that we don't find in some of the earlier dialogues. They are much more difficult reading for some of them for that reason. And so those are the three categories. Now we've read a couple of traditionally considered early pieces. The other works of Plato we're going to be reading are mostly from the middle period. So the Phaedo is considered generally to be a middle period dialogue, even though it fits right in dramatically with the other two dialogues, the Apology and the Crito, that we've read so far. And that's not unique to the Phaedo. As you read more in Plato and more beyond just what we are reading this term here, you'll see that references and allusions to Socrates' trial, or placing the dramatic date of the dialogue somewhere in the neighborhood of the date of Socrates' trial, is something that Plato does very, very often. That happens a lot. So that's a little bit of an introduction to the Phaedo, and next time we're going to be looking at a few of the themes that come up in the Phaedo. In particular, his introduction of what we now call Plato's theory of forms, a term that Plato himself never used. He never said, here's my theory of forms. But today, scholars call it the theory of forms. And we see it being formulated in several successive steps in the dialogue Phaedo. So we'll look at that next time. Until then, take care.